Good evening, everyone. I'm going to begin. If you could take your seats and maybe scooch in a little bit so that if we have any latecomers, we can accommodate as many people as possible. I'm Chris Stover, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, which is co-founded by the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. Let us begin by acknowledging our presence today in the traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq, the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Tonight's event was organized by the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, or CCEPA, and the Enrich Project, with support from Dalhousie University's Office of the President and the Faculty of Health Professions. CCEPA provides an arena for critical thinking, public discussion, and research into ethical challenges in society. The Enrich Project deals with environmental noxiousness, racial inequities, and community health. It's headed up by Ingrid Waldron at Dalhousie University, and I need to say that we could not have done this series nearly as well without Ingrid. This series has previously covered the areas of white, Black, and immigrant perspectives, and has clearly illustrated how very much there is to learn as we endeavor to live together more effectively. CCEPA is learning, as we all are, that difficult conversations are indeed difficult. But we must keep having them despite those difficulties, because how we live matters. Our moderator for this evening's question period is Patricia Doyle Bedwell. Patricia is a professor and a Native Studies instructor, a lawyer, and a writer. She has served as the chair of the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women for 10 years. She works closely with Mi'kmaq communities, the Native Women's Association of Canada, Women in the Law, and has also had the opportunity to work with the United Nations on women and Aboriginal issues. We're very pleased that Patricia is joining us tonight. I'm truly honored to be able to introduce to you now not only an outstanding Canadian, but a very remarkable and fine human being. Senator Sinclair served the justice system in Manitoba for over 25 years. He was the first Aboriginal judge appointed in Manitoba and Canada's second. He has served as co-chair of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba and as chief of the Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As head of the TRC, he has participated in hundreds of hearings across Canada, culminating in the issuance of the TRC's report in 2015. He also oversaw an active multi-million-dollar fundraising campaign to support various TRC events and activities and to allow survivors to travel and attend those events. Senator Sinclair has been invited to speak throughout Canada and the United States, as well as internationally, including the Cambridge Lectures for members of the judiciary of various Commonwealth courts in England. In fact, we learned earlier today that the senator receives upwards of 400 invitations a month to speak. So we are doubly grateful he has welcomed this particular one. Senator Sinclair has served as an adjunct professor of law at the University of Manitoba. He was very active within his profession and his community and has won numerous awards, including the National Aboriginal Achievement Award, the Manitoba Bar Association's Equality Award in 2001, and its Distinguished Service Award in 2016. He has received honorary doctorates from 8 Canadian universities, and in April this year, Senator Sinclair was appointed to the Canadian Senate. Please join me in a very warm welcome for Senator Murray Sinclair.
Bonjour, Genocidal, Indigenous, Dodem. Can you hear me up there in the clouds? All right, good. We're always testing the sound system to make sure that I get heard. But thank you all for coming this evening. This is quite a packed assembly, so I hope that we can keep you all awake during the course of the evening. I want to begin by thanking for the introduction, thanking the university and thanking CCEPA for inviting me to be here, for allowing me to be part of this very important dialogue on racism. I'd also like to confirm that I have been welcomed here by the Mi'kmaq people who have been present with me throughout this week because I've been here since Sunday night. And I told Stephen Augustine I was going to mention the fact that he's not here this evening because he has dogged my footsteps for the last 3 days. But he had another event that he had to attend to. And I did want to also say that in the course of the last few days, I've had the pleasure of speaking to students and to faculty in other locations as well. The history of residential schools has been most of what I've been talking about for the last little while in relation to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and our report. But there's a little bit of a twist tonight because I'm going to talk about the context of residential schools and the whole question of the experience of racism of Indigenous people and individually and collectively in this country. Because the topic of the lecture series is about racism and about the Indigenous perspective of racism. And I want to begin in a few minutes by showing you a video because I think we need to understand what racism can and has done to Indigenous people over the course of the years. But I want to, before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about the issue of individual racism or the actions of racists and the issue of systemic racism. Individual racism or the actions of racists against individuals or collectives within society is a common experience that we as individual people, as Indigenous people, share with other people of color, other people of different faiths, other people in society who also experience racism. It's not that much different. When people are attacked, whether verbally or physically or emotionally, for being of different color, of being a different faith, of being just different, of being someone who is not part of the group, that extends to all people who are victims of those attacks. And the experiences are often the same, generally the same. The shame, the humiliation, the anger that results from that is quite significant. What I want to talk about this evening, though, is the systemic racism that Indigenous people have experienced in this country. And what I mean by systemic racism is the fact that the system of government, the system of institutions in society have been the main culprit when it comes to looking at the impact that racism has had on the lives of Indigenous people. And in order to talk about the impact that the collective racism over the years has had and systemic racism has had on the lives of Indigenous people, I want to play a video for you. And those of you who are on the sides may get necks broken because it's going to be shown on this screen up behind me. And so you may need to adjust your view just a little bit in order to be able to see it. But just let me explain a little bit about this video and where it came from. This video is essentially a video written by a singer, created by a song that a young man by the name of Aaron Peters wrote back in 1996 or thereabout. He was about 17 years old and was coming out of the child welfare system as a foster child. And he wrote about his experience as a foster child. But he was writing as well about what he had learned through the work of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, which I co-chaired with my colleague, Associate Chief Justice Hamilton in Manitoba in 1991, that he was aware of the impact that had occurred on his life and the life of other children who were caught up in the child welfare system who were of Indigenous ancestry by virtue of the laws of Manitoba. And I'll talk more fully about those laws in a minute. But he connected the issue of children in the child welfare system and the issue of residential schools very well. And this was back in 1996, long before people were talking about this. That's 20 years ago. And when he wrote the song, he brought it to me and played it for me. And I was very impressed both with his talent as a singer and as a songwriter, and I encouraged him to get it recorded, which he did. We put him in touch with someone who produces music, and they recorded it, and he used that to launch a musical career. When we started the TRC, or when I was asked to chair the TRC in 2009, I called Aaron up and I said, I'd like to take your song and utilize it for the work of the TRC and have it put into video form, and we'll play it at TRC events, particularly for the population of people who don't understand what the impact of residential schools continues to have on the lives of young people today. And so that's what this video is about. It's about how racist policies, racist behavior, and racist legislation from the past continues to impact people today, young Indigenous people. And so I'd like you to watch this video, and then I'm going to talk to you about it.
Cry out. kids cry out. Don't let what happened to us be forgotten.
Powerful video, eh? He's a very talented young man, so those of you, if you're ever in the Toronto area, watch out for him because he still performs, he still travels throughout the communities, he still talks to young groups about what he does, and he's a wonderful spokesman for that kind of an issue because he is a child of the child welfare system. And he can tell you from firsthand experience what impact it had upon his life. But here's the issue. It's not just about him. It's about lots of kids. There are more children caught up in the child welfare system today from Indigenous communities and Indigenous families than ever went into residential schools. More children. For 150 years, Canada established residential schools in this country for the purpose of taking children away from their families at young ages. 6, 7, 8 years of age, placing them into schools that were designed not to educate, despite the fact that they were called schools, but to indoctrinate them into a different culture, for the purpose of eliminating the culture known as Indianism, or Indians. In fact, back in 1883, our good friend and our hero, Sir John A. Macdonald, said this: "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write." I always thought it would be a cool thing for us to get t-shirts made up saying, "I'm a savage who can read and write." Because we've moved beyond that. We've proven, in fact, that that image of inferiority, which is behind that statement, is so blatantly wrong and unfair and unjust that it smacks not only of racism, but of a genocidal view of things. The UN Convention on Genocide was passed in 1949 by the United Nations. Canada was a signatory to it. And in Article 2E of that convention, it says that it is an act of genocide to forcibly remove children from one culture, one racial group, and place them with another racial group for the purpose of eliminating the first racial group. And that's what Sir John A. Macdonald wanted to do. And that's what Canada tried to do during the whole entire process of residential schools, was to take children away from their parents, little children, away from their parents, place them into institutions for the purpose of indoctrinating them into Canadian culture, to make them think that they were no longer Indians, that they were Canadians, that they were British subjects, that they were something other than they were. And they were punished physically for speaking their language, for trying to practice their culture, for trying to stay connected to their culture. Documents have been found which show that teachers would not allow children to go back home unless the parents promised that they wouldn't speak their language with the children. They wouldn't try to take their children to traditional ceremonies. They wouldn't try to teach their children about their own history as a people. So the intention of the residential schools and the policies that were behind it and supported it were clearly to wipe out the culture and the language of Indigenous people. And while they didn't totally wipe out the languages and cultures, they were severely damaged. Because children were in those schools for 7 generations. Now, that was bad enough. Of course, we've heard many stories about what happened to the children in the schools. They were disciplined harshly, physically injured while there through the discipline. And when parents were learning or had learned about what was happening, they wanted to do something about it, as would you. If your children were taken away from you, or if you were convinced by government this was the only form of education they would get, and therefore send us your children and we'll educate them. And if you did that and then found out how they were being treated, what would you do about it? Well, you'd probably want to keep them from being taken there. The government passed a law in 1885 that said any parent who refuses to send their children to a residential school designated by the Minister of Indian Affairs, who happened to be Sir John A. Macdonald, incidentally, was guilty of an offense, could be prosecuted, and held in custody until the child was produced and sent to the school. And if a parent was successful in hiding the child, then the parent nonetheless could be prosecuted and locked up, and many were. We have evidence that shows that many people, many Indigenous people, simply left the country and moved into the United States to get away from this kind of policy. And Indigenous people from Nova Scotia went down to Maine and to Massachusetts and moved their families down there to get away from this policy because they didn't bother pursuing you if you did that. So the government passed a law that said if you live outside of the country for 2 years or more, you lost your rights as a treaty Indian in Canada, and you lost your right to be registered as an Indigenous person in Canada because of your absence. You lost any financial benefits that you would otherwise receive, and you lost all of your rights to live back in your home community. So you couldn't come back if you stayed away for 2 years trying to protect your children. And if you stayed and you tried to fight, you wanted to go to court, for example. That's what people do these days, right? We litigate everything. We sue everybody. What lawyers like to tell you, sue everybody. So you go and hire a lawyer, you want to sue them, government passed a law in 1887 or so, 1888. It said nobody can sue the government of Canada on behalf of an Indian person unless they got permission from the Minister of Indian Affairs first. There is no recorded instance of the Minister of Indian Affairs ever giving permission to being sued. And that not only covered Indigenous people who wanted to sue, it also covered friends of Indigenous people because friendship societies popped up all over the place. Members of the Anglican Church formed friendship societies in response to what the government was doing. And they were prohibited from suing the government until they got permission, and they never got permission. And if you can't sue, maybe you can get some legal advice from a lawyer to determine what your rights might be and what else you might do. Any lawyer that agreed to give an Indian person legal advice about what their rights might be to prevent them from complying with the Indian Act would be automatically disbarred unless the Minister of Indian Affairs gave him permission to give that advice. So lawyers were prevented from giving advice. Well, if you can't get legal advice and you can't go to court, maybe you could do the next best thing, which is what everybody else does these days. You protest, right? Make signs, you walk up and down the road and you say, I protest all of these things I'm prohibited from doing. Well, the government passed a law about that. It said, if 3 or more Indians get together for the purpose of talking about a complaint against the government of Canada, they're guilty of an Indian conspiracy. And they could be prosecuted and sent to jail. So Indian conspiracy laws, not unlike the conspiracies you see in Bill C-51, incidentally, that was passed a few years ago, made it against the law simply to talk about doing something to change the government's mind or to change a law or change a policy. Simply for talking about it. So you can't go to court, you can't protest. Maybe you could vote them out of office. Now, many people believe that Indigenous people didn't have the right to vote, but that's not true. In 1885, Sir John A. Macdonald, in his zeal to try to get Indian people to act like civilized human beings, gave Indigenous people the right to vote, as long as they complied with provincial voting laws. And that meant that you had to be a man, you had to own property outside of the reserve that's worth £100, and you had to be over 21. Well, women weren't allowed to vote, but no woman was allowed to vote in Sir John A.'s day. And if you qualified in that way, then as an Indian person, you could exercise the right to vote. Well, that was taken away in 1891 because those Mohawks voted a Conservative MP out of office. And so the right to vote was taken away in 1891 through a law, interestingly, called the Indian Advancement Act. And the Indian Advancement Act contained an interesting provision because it said that you could only vote if you were a person, and a person was defined as meaning anybody other than an Indian. So Indians became non-persons in 1891. So laws were passed that, of course, meant that legal rights that every other member of Canadian society had were not available to Indigenous people, Indians, especially under the Indian Act. But everybody was caught by those laws. If you looked like an Indian and they thought you were an Indian, they'd still denied you those rights. And of course, parents might think about going to the schools and just taking their kids out and running away with them. But they restricted movement by passing a policy that said you can't leave your reserve unless you get a written pass from the Indian agent, whose pass would have to be in writing and would have to specify where you were going, how long you were there, and when you'd have to come back. So the Indian pass system, about which there's a video or a movie now, and it's worth seeing, was enacted in the 1880s as well. So the right of voting, the right to go to court, the right to protest, the right to move, the right to leave your community, the right to take any kind of social, legal, or political action, were all rights taken away from Indigenous people to prevent them from interfering with the government's genocidal policy of eliminating their race. And so when we talk about the racism that Indigenous people have experienced, we have to look at not only the abuse that they receive at the hands of people in society, which they do receive, the humiliation and the shameful things that people say about Indigenous people today, it's still there, just as they say it about people from other countries, they say about women, but it has a foundation built upon those kinds of government-led policies. So the government of this country established those policies in law and kept them in place until 1952, when they amended the Indian Act to take most of those provisions out, except for the mandatory school attendance provisions, which remained. But most of those policies were removed in response to, I think, the UN Convention on Genocide, because the government of Canada did not want to open itself up to being taken before the World Court to be prosecuted for committing genocide against Indigenous people. And the UN Convention on Genocide didn't cover previous acts, only those that occurred after the passage. And only if the country, in fact, enacted a law adopting the convention as Canadian law, which Canada didn't do until the 1970s, interestingly, till well after they had passed a law giving control of Indian education over to First Nations people. So by that point in time, Canada was effectively moving out of the residential school business. But here's the kicker. What they did in 1950 in response to that change in law, change in policy, was they got Indian parents to sign over guardianship to the minister. So that now, instead of sending your own child to the school, you were giving your child over to the government in the 1950s. So you lost custody, you lost guardianship of your own child in order for your child to get an education. That's how they protected themselves from the accusation that they were forcibly removing the children from the parents, because in writing it looked like the parents were consenting. In fact, you had to apply to have your child put into a residential school. So it looked like you were asking them to take your child away from you, when in reality it was the only education most Indigenous families had available to them. So through manipulation of forms and policies and law, the government of Canada continued that activity for a long period of time. Now, it's bad enough that abuse occurred within the schools, and the children who were taken to those schools were infected with the teachings that they were coming from a heathen, savage background, and that their people were inferior, their people were irrelevant, they weren't even part of Confederation, they weren't part of the nation-building process, they were not worthy of being considered a civilized people. Not only was that going on in residential schools, but that same kind of message was beginning to be taught in the public schools of our country as well. And I speak here from experience when I tell you that as a school student in the public schools, I was well aware of what the school was teaching us about us. They were talking about us as though we were savages, as though we were the problem, as though we were the mentally inferior people who lost a country, not through the deceit of the government or the harsh hand of the government, but simply because we weren't smart enough to hang on to it, that we weren't smart enough to know what was going on. That's how come we were in the position of no longer being owners of the territory, of no longer being able to enforce the agreements that we had signed, because we were not smart enough to do that. That's the message we were getting. And as Indigenous children in public schools, we, of course, were highlighted in the school textbooks when they talked about how the savage Indians would be attacking the settlers, the savage Indians would be burning people at the stake, the savage Indians would be ripping the hearts out of those missionaries, and those poor missionaries were suffering terribly at the hands of those Indian people. A different tribe of people from me, but I felt shame because of that, as did everybody else in my group. But the other side of that coin was the non-Indigenous people were learning that story as well, that we were inferior, that we, in fact, were going to disappear except for the fact that Sir John A. Macdonald made sure we got an education. And if it wasn't for the government of Canada, we would be an extinct people. They talked about Edward Curtis. We always had Edward Curtis's photographs being shown to us, and Edward Curtis went around North America photographing all the Indigenous people he could find, because he believed, as many Americans did, as in fact the government's policy was, that Indian people were going to disappear. Ultimately, they were a disappearing race. That was a common theme in the 19th century and the early 20th century, up until I went to school, that we were going to disappear. And the only reason we didn't disappear was because of the good graces of the European settlers and their governments that came over here and saved us from extinction. So that message of our inferiority and of European superiority was a message taught in public schools for many generations. Certainly before I started school in the 1950s, but it was even taught after I was in school, until relatively recently. And in some schools, in fact, it still permeates the messaging that goes on, partly because the curriculum materials haven't changed a lot in most schools in the last 20 years. But what does that do? Well, it means that in order to get through that system, you have to have a strong will. You have to have a strong, persevering ability just to get through it, to put up with that. And you have to be willing to surrender your dignity and your pride and be willing to accept the mantle of inferiority in whatever it is that you do. And I did that. Many people did that. You had to do it in order to graduate, in order to get the marks that we had to get in order to go to university. We had to be prepared to recite back to the teachers the things that they were telling us about us. And we did that in order to get out of that system and to move on. But it does something to you. It does something to you internally, emotionally, mentally. It teaches you to hate yourself. It teaches you to hate your people. And I can't tell you how many people I grew up with who dropped out of school because of that, because they couldn't stand it anymore. Sometimes they would fight the teachers, they'd fight other students, they'd be angry about what they were being told. They didn't believe it, they didn't want to believe it. And so they would quit. So if they didn't weed you out, you weeded yourself out. The dropout rates in schools for Indigenous people when I went to school were enormously high, and they're still very high, even to this day. And that's the impact of that history of racism on Indigenous people. But one of the silent impacts has been this. When I was a little guy, I could speak Ojibwe, I could speak Cree, because my grandfather was Cree. I could speak French and English. And as I grew up, my grandmother, who had been to residential school, said, and she was the one raising me, said to all of my aunties, all of the adults in my life, they could no longer speak Cree and Ojibwe to us. They could only speak English or French, because that was the language of the dominant culture that she wanted us to go into. And why did she do it? We heard similar stories from other survivors of residential schools when they would ask their parents, why didn't you teach me the language? Because you can still speak it. Sometimes they would be told, because I wanted to save your life. And that's kind of an odd thing to hear, because nobody's going to kill you for speaking Ojibwe. Even in the racist days, well, maybe you might encounter the odd person who would be willing to do that, but it wasn't that kind of death that she was worried about. It was this: they were taught in residential schools that if you still tried to practice your culture, when you died, you were going to go to hell. And you would spend the rest of your life, the rest of eternity, living in hell. And so that's what my grandmother meant. That's what all of those other surviving parents meant when they would say to their children, because I wanted to save your life. I didn't want you to spend eternity in hell. And it's kind of sad when you think about it. That fear still permeated their very existence. Very strong, very powerful, and persistent even to this day. Indigenous people have in fact now become our own worst oppressors. Canadian society has given up on enforcing laws that prevent us from doing our own ceremonies, practicing our own culture, speaking our language. But in the Indigenous schools and First Nation communities, it's Indigenous parents who are saying, we don't want our children to learn that culture. We don't want our children to be taught that language, because they still have that fear. They still have that belief that it's wrong. And so when the victim starts to enforce the laws of the victimizer, that's what you call a perfect crime. That's what you call a perfect crime. And so Aaron Peters had the idea right from the beginning. This was the perfect crime. And in fact, children who are being taken away from their families today and placed into the child welfare system, Indigenous children, that is, often are voluntarily surrendered by their parents, because their parents are being convinced by social workers that the kids will be better off being raised in another family setting. And they believe it. They believe it because they look at their lives and they think, we're not doing so hot. I'm not doing so well. I don't have a good environment at home. I can't raise my child myself. Maybe there's an auntie, maybe there's a grandparent, maybe there's a big brother, big sister, or cousin that could raise their child, but they're not given that option. they're told it's either you or it's us. So if you can't raise a child, you have to give them to us. That's what the social workers say. Whereas Indigenous families, as happened to me, when I was a year old and my little brother was born, my mother died. My father, who had been a victim of violence during the Second World War, was badly injured, could not only not cope with raising us himself, he could barely cope with life as a veteran of the war. And he left us with his mother and father, our grandparents. If a social worker had intervened, they would have taken us away from her. But I was blessed by the fact that she was a fierce woman, and she was not going to let anybody take her children away from the family. So even though she was 63 years old and my grandfather was in his early 70s, she insisted on bringing us into the fold because she had 8 daughters still living at home with her. And so each of us were assigned to one of those daughters. My Auntie Josephine was my mentor. She was the one who was responsible for taking care of me. So wherever she went, wherever she moved to, until I became a young teenager and went off to university, I was her responsibility. But my grandmother watched what she did and made sure that she did the right thing. But that's not allowed today in the system because Indigenous people don't look to their own families for those helps, for that help. And social workers in the child welfare system don't even think about extended family as a valid option anymore. It's hard for them in most jurisdictions to make that effort because if one of them fails, then it becomes a problem for them in the future. And it's interesting because just about every provincial government has a child welfare law which mandates that you have to look at extended family placements as an option. But they're looked at in a very cursory way. And the evidence of that is the fact that there are more children in care today in non-related family environments than have ever been placed in residential schools in this country. And that's an amazing statistic. And if young children are not being placed into child welfare, and even if they are, ultimately they're going to end up in jails. That's another feature of the child welfare system, is how they're failing those children, because those children end up in the youth justice system. That tells you that that system is failing to take care of them properly. I've told my colleagues in courts, in the family divisions who make those decisions about putting children into care, if somebody came to you and said, listen, I've got 100 kids that you've given me in custody of and I'm raising them well, I'd like you to give me this kid, and you look behind what they're saying and you realize of those 100 kids you've given to that person before, 50 of them had ended up in jail, would you really give that person another child? No, you wouldn't. But we do it all the time with child welfare agencies. We don't look at their track record. The track record of child welfare agencies is not all that good. And there's lots of reasons for it. Some of them are so badly resourced and so overworked that they can't handle the number of cases they get. It may not be their fault, but it's certainly not the child's fault. And he's the one who bears the consequences. We have to find a better way. So the issue that we need to think about is, what is the system doing? What is our government system, our legal system doing? And how is it going about its work? It needs to change the tools it uses. It needs to change the way it thinks about things. In one situation in Manitoba, an Indigenous agency decided that taking children out of the home and placing them into another home somewhere else didn't make any sense when the children didn't do anything. So they went in and they removed the parents, left the children in the home, and brought in some extended family members and said, now you take care of these kids and we'll support you financially to do that. Now that makes a lot of sense. So the government of Manitoba looked at that and said, all right, doesn't abide by the rules. So we can't fund you for that. Department of Indigenous Affairs says, sorry, that doesn't comply with the rules of the agreement, but we can't fund you for that. And so the agencies are having to do it with limited resources. And they're struggling. They're struggling with the fact that they're trying to make the best of a difficult situation. But we have to change the way we do things. And in the meantime, what you saw in that video is not at all different from what's going on out in the streets. You see kids in the streets, particularly in Western Canada, who are hanging out, young girls who are being caught up in sex rings, who are having to prostitute themselves, young boys who are joining gangs and having gang fights and killing each other on the streets. You are more likely as a young person under the age of 18 to be violently assaulted by another Indigenous person than you are by a non-Indigenous person. And the highest cause of death among young Indigenous people is violence. Suicide is getting to be a close second. Suicide rates among Indigenous youth are 8 times, 10 times the rate of non-Indigenous people. And when we see what happens in some communities, we immediately call in the mental health professionals and say, let's fix this. But I'm not convinced it's a mental health issue. I think it's a cultural issue. I think that young Indigenous people need help to understand who they are and to be given the tools that they need through the work of elders and traditional teachers to find their self-respect and their identity. But mental health professionals who are trained in Western medical model systems can't give that to them. They can give them pills, they can give them therapy, come and talk to me as long as I can sit here and listen to you. But after an hour or so, I got to go talk to the next person. And that isn't going to work, particularly if it's not another Indigenous person that they're being called upon to talk to, because they can't give them what they need. In other environments, I've said, we really need to think about the fact that this is about life for those young people. And they have to be able to answer 4 questions. All of us have to be able to answer 4 questions as we're growing up. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? Those young people don't know the answers to those questions. They don't know where they come from. They don't know their history. They don't know their culture. They don't know their language. They don't know their own creation story. They don't feel a sense of validation by what they've been told. All they feel is an emptiness about that. They feel a sense of loss about that. They can't speak their own language. And that causes them not just anger, but sadness. Deep, deep sadness. And they don't know where they're going. They don't know what their future holds. They don't know what their professional ambitions could or should be. And as a result, they feel loss about that. And they don't know what happens to them after they die. They don't know their teachings. So that sense of faith in life is not reinforced by those things, as they are for everybody else. They don't know why they are here. One of the big questions of life we all try to struggle with is, why am I here? Why are we here? What are we all doing in this place? Why did God create this place? Is there really a God? Or did we just crawl out of the water like the scientists tell us? And if so, why did he let us do that? Why did he put us here? Or she? Whatever it is that created this, what's the purpose of us being here? And if you understand that you do have a purpose, and what that purpose is, it gives you a sense of importance, another sense of validation, another sense of responsibility. And if you don't have that, you're missing something important. And you're missing out on being able to answer that 4th question, which is, who am I? Who am I? who are we, but who am I? Part of the discussion around racism is about whether or not there's such a thing as race. I think it doesn't really matter whether or not there's race, there's racism. They'll find it by any other name. They'll call religious differences racism. Color of skin differences is racism. The height of people, that'll be racism. Any factor of difference will become part of that dialogue of treatment. So it doesn't really matter whether there's a race, but who am I gives you a sense of importance, a sense of what it is that all of this is conspired to do for you and with you. And it also helps you understand the importance of asking the related question is, who do I want to be? What do I want to be? And it's part of that too. And if you don't have the capacity to ask the question, you don't have the ability to answer it. And part of all of that experience is to learn how to ask and answer those questions for yourself. And I can tell you, if you're doing it all the time, you're too busy to be doing anything else. And that's part of the problem, is we don't know how to ask. We don't know who to ask. We don't know where to look for the answers. And therefore, we feel lost. Reconciliation is part of what the work is that I do and that I've done as part of the TRC. And even in the Senate is part of the work that I'm determined to do in the Senate, to ensure that the senators, the legislators of this country, the leaders of our government, understand the importance of doing what governments need to do to make it easier for Indigenous children to be able to answer those 4 questions. Because if we can help them to answer those 4 questions, then their sense of victimization, their sense of feeling lost, their lack of self-respect, their loss of identity, and their sadness about that will be reduced to a large extent. But in addition to that, non-Indigenous people, if they are given access to the same kind of information, will also feel a great deal more respect for Indigenous people as well. And if we can create an aura in our schools of respect for each other, respect for where we come from, respect for our teachings of the afterlife, respect for our teachings of purpose and who we are, then that will totally change the conversation we have to, with, and about each other. And if we can change that conversation, then we'll eliminate a lot of that conflict, which we now call racism. Racism is a conflict based fundamentally on misunderstanding, misperception, and misdirection. And I think that we need to concentrate upon young people and recognize that it will take us more than one generation to fix all that. So with that, I want to indicate to you that this has been an experience that I have worked through now for the last several years. And I hope that you can understand the importance that we should place upon educating our children. Little ones know instantly how to respect each other. And now what we need to do is give them the opportunity to continue that throughout their educational career. So I want to thank you for letting me be part of this lecture series and for your attention during this evening. And I'll be around later on somewhere, they tell me, for questions. Thank you.
on a second. I don't know if I'm doing this right. I don't know. I could break something. There, hello. I have the honor of moderating this discussion, and I'd like to I'm Patty Doyle Bedwell, by the way. I'm Mi'kmaq from Bottledeck. Thank you. I'm one of those migratory Micmacs that went back and forth to Maine, because my mother was a residential school survivor and she didn't want us to go through that. I figured that out when I was like 35.
That was just last year, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Just last year, it all came to me. We're being live streamed, and we want to take the opportunity to take questions for Senator from the audience, and I have the honor of moderating that. And I'd like to remind everybody that we want to have an open discussion, a respectful discussion, and to have a variety, as many people as we can ask questions. We're also having a reception afterwards, so people are going to have an opportunity to also speak with Justice Sinclair as well. So there are 2 microphones, I think. No, 1. I see 1. 1 microphone, and if people are interested, they can come up to the microphone. We're also going to be taking questions from the live stream, and if anybody is watching on the internet and they have a question, they can send that question in, and we will have it sent. They will have it sent to me, and I don't have to do the computer stuff, thank goodness. And then we will ask the question. So, is there anybody who is interested? Please ask a question, so we can have a good dialogue. If you'd like to come up to the microphone, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, we could bring it over.
Take the microphone to her.
I think I'll speak loud enough because
Well, we need to record it on the webcast.
It's being recorded. That's why. Thank you, Kara.
Which, thank you. Justice Sinclair, I asked this question of you about 1.5 years ago at Church of the Redeemer in Toronto when you spoke.
The same answer then, okay?
Yeah. Well, I was living there at the time. Now I'm lucky enough to live in this great province of Nova Scotia. But it was a different audience. This is something that always troubles me. How many children disappeared in the residential schools?
We don't know. We don't know. And the reason we don't know is because the records are incomplete. We have identified by name 3,700 children who disappeared or died in the schools. We know that there were several hundred more, several thousand more probably, but several hundred more who the families have not been able to trace, that families have reported that were lost to the schools. And what we said in our report was that when the TRC was created, this was not one of our mandate issues, but we discovered early on that this was an issue for the survivors, because many survivors told us about knowing about children who had died in the schools and where they were buried. And so as that became known to us, we commissioned a small research initiative to go out and mark the grave sites and locations of children who we knew had been buried. In some cases, we found 3 or 4 to a grave, most of whom died because of disease, and the records were incomplete about where they were buried. Certainly, they didn't disclose that so many were buried in one grave, for example, but we did record the names of 3,700 based upon the records we found, but there are huge gaps in the records. And the Department of Indigenous Affairs now, Indian Affairs at the time, said those records were inadvertently destroyed or were accidentally destroyed during fires or floods, and yet they made no effort to try to replicate them or replace them. So we approached all of the departments of vital statistics in Canada who kept records from about 1920 on in Eastern Canada and in Western Canada from the time that their agencies got established shortly thereafter, to look at their provincial records and tell us how many children of Indigenous ancestry, because they used to keep track of the racial identity of children who died, how many of them died during the era that residential schools were most active until 1960. And so the department, the Vital Statistics branch of British Columbia gave us a complete list of names, but not all of them, of course, were in residential schools. Some of them would have died at home, some of them would have died in birth, some of them would have died who were not going to residential schools, who may have been going to public schools. So the only way to determine that was to match those names against school attendance records. And we have all of the school attendance records. And that's now at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So one of our calls to action was to call upon governments, federally and provincially, to provide sufficient resources for a complete research project to identify the names of those children who died while in residential school. Now, I can tell you that the only research initiative that ever occurred was done by Dr. Peter Bryce in the 1907 to 1911 era, when he, as the chief medical officer for the Department of Indigenous Affairs, looked at death rates for 7 residential schools in the prairies, and he concluded that between 25 and 40% of the children in those schools at that time died while in the school or shortly after being sent home from the schools. And so his comment was, if this happened anywhere else, this would be considered a national crime, and he thinks it is a national crime, and that became the title of his report. And that information was shared, he shared that with a lawyer friend of his who gave the opinion that the government of Canada is coming very close to being charged with manslaughter for allowing the conditions to exist that gave rise to such high death rates. And so that report was delivered to the government of Canada in around 1911 or so. And Peter Bryce submitted his report. He was thanked for his report, and then he was fired. And it was at that point that we noticed the records start to disappear, and that it's conceivable that the schools were directed, because we can't find the correspondence, it's not clear, but the schools may have been directed not to record the names of children dying anymore. And the other thing that we know they did do was they started transferring children out of the dormitories into the infirmaries in the school, and ruling that because they died in an infirmary, they were no longer in the school. So we didn't get access to the infirmary records until after a court battle. And once we started looking at the infirmary records, we saw that many of the school infirmaries is where children were dying who had been placed there by the school, but it was just down the hall from the dormitory, and they were still, in our view, still residential school students. But they were not recorded as school deaths. They were recorded simply as deaths under Health Canada records and not under Indian Affairs records. So the answer to your question is we don't know. 3,700 names for sure. I think it's probably 3, 4, or 5 times that. I think as many as 15,000 or more. If Peter Bryce's assessment of 25 to 40% is anywhere near accurate, and even if it's less than that, say at 15%, 150,000 students went through those particular schools in the era that we looked at. And so even if you take 10%, that's 15,000 names. And I don't think that's far off. Might even be higher. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from the online streaming, and the question is, what is the single biggest hurdle standing in the way of truth and reconciliation?
There is no single biggest hurdle. There's too many hurdles to name for sure. One of them is the lack of a plan on the part of the federal government. The Prime Minister has indicated a willingness and made a statement in which he wants to change the relationship. But I think there's still too many outstanding issues for us to be thinking that reconciliation is achievable anytime soon or that truth is determined fully. There are a lot of residential schools that have not been included in the settlement agreement, where people were excluded from the settlement process, who still suffered abuse at the hands of provincial schools, provincially run schools. Now, every Indigenous person was sent to a school by the Government of Canada, but they were often sent to schools that the Government of Canada did not manage. All of those schools were excluded from the settlement agreement. And we estimate that there's probably 1,000 of those schools, in addition to the 137 that were included in the settlement agreement. There's probably another 1,000 schools that Indigenous children were sent to by the government that are not included in the settlement agreement because the Government of Canada denied legal responsibility for those children because they didn't run the schools. Somebody else ran the schools. Those children, those students who went to those schools were not covered by the settlement agreement, and some have litigated their case. Recently, Newfoundland Labrador survivors litigated their case and received a settlement agreement, but they were not permitted to include a TRC process in their settlement agreement. So the answer is there's probably several thousand other survivors out there who have been subjected to abuse in schools that the government sent them to that the government does not accept legal responsibility for, who believe that they are not included in the reconciliation process. One large group I'll tell you about are the Métis. Métis students were sent to schools, generally Catholic-run schools, that were paid for by the Government of Canada, that abused them in the same way that the First Nations kids were abused, and they're not covered by any settlement agreement. So there's a lawsuit relating to them as well. Yes? Thank you.
Justice Sinclair, Paul Bennett. I'm an adjunct professor here at St. Mary's University, and I've just finished doing a policy paper on the Thunder Bay inquiry into the disappearance and death of the 7 youth that were in the schools in Thunder Bay. And I wanted to ask you a question that I don't think is asked too often, which is, we've read your report. We're extremely concerned about what happened in the residential schools. But does it mean that there'll never be residential schools again? Or is it just that we need to work on making them better than they are? You recall the inquiry recommended that there be ideally high schools in each of the First Nations communities. But in the interim, is it possible to have a school like Dennis Franklin Cromarty made welcoming and a community welcoming enough that it could work in the interim?
There are such schools. One in Winnipeg is a school run by the Southeast Tribal Council in the city of Winnipeg. I think it's called Southeast College, where they accept First Nation students from all across Manitoba who want to get a high school education. And it's a residential school, so the children go there, they stay in residence, they receive a culturally appropriate education. They're taught by Indigenous teachers. The Indigenous teachers, many of whom are either children of or themselves survivors of residential schools, know what to avoid. They're very sensitive to the fact that it's a residential school environment, so they put in place proper supports for the students who are distant from their families to ensure that they don't lose contact with their families and that they receive emotional and other kinds of supports that they need while they're away from home. So residential schools in and of themselves are not the problem, as long as they're run properly. I think the problem is that there is a tendency to believe that schools should not be built in First Nations communities, and I think that's a mistake. I think that First Nations communities should be entitled to have a school, but if they choose not to have one because they don't have enough students or because the frequency of high school students may not justify the cost of maintaining a building, they can combine their resources and create a central school to which they can send children from their communities. And that's often been discussed, but the government of Canada is not yet willing to fund that. But I suspect that it will continue to be part of the dialogue going forward. As long as the residential school is run properly, and there are proper supports in place for the students who are there to overcome the issues of distance, loneliness, and loss of family contact, and that's addressed appropriately, I think it can work. Many people, in fact, in Canadian society go to boarding schools for their education, private boarding schools, and receive an adequate or good education through that process. But at the same time, residential schools can become centers of abuse if you're not careful. So they have to be carefully monitored, and you have to make sure you've got proper safeguards in place. And that means you have to have proper resources.
Thank you. We have another question from our online streaming, and it's, what would you suggest people do to help get the child welfare system to make an effort to place children with extended family?
We have issued a 6,000-page report, and the first 8 or 9 calls to action are about that. It would require that the resources for first of all, that Indigenous resources, Indigenous agencies need to be established with a proper focus upon culturally appropriate placements, and that they be adequately resourced, and that the entire system, because most children are apprehended in urban areas, so they're not necessarily caught up in an Indigenous system, but that proper monitoring of Indigenous children in provincial care also take place, so that the provincial agency needs to be accountable for what it's doing for Indigenous people. But ultimately, we have proposed that there should be a federal Indian child welfare law, which establishes Indian agencies or Indigenous agencies throughout the country to give them jurisdiction, because provinces will be reluctant to give it up. Instead of going back to the 13 territorial and provincial jurisdictions to ask them for permission to create these agencies, the federal government can do it in one fell swoop with a federal law. And we think that's the way to go.
Thank you. Next, Dylan.
Hi, my name is Dylan Latondre. I'm Métis from Saskatchewan. My dad was taken in 1961 from his mother and was raised in an orphanage with other First Nation and Métis kids at the time. And it was a very difficult experience for him, and he came out a very unhealthy person. Luckily, he was able to reconnect with his culture, and that's been a big part of my life growing up. But I've found that coming to university has been a challenge because it's distanced me from some of the cultural supports that he's been able to reconnect with. So my question is, to contextualize it, there was a talk at this university last week that equated Indigenous knowledge with pseudoscience. In society today, there's a lot of emphasis put on gaining a university education. So when universities are perceived to be the legitimate places of knowledge in society, and university professors devalue Indigenous ways of knowing, how do we support students in asking those 4 questions that you mentioned earlier?
Well, the easy answer is to get rid of the prof. But that's not the right answer. The reason it's not the right answer is because systems just replace people like that sometimes with other people like that. And so what needs to be done is the system itself needs to ensure that it as a system validates and values the other side of the coin and allows for those kinds of perceptions to be properly debated. But they shouldn't be the means by which students are educated and are required to be educated. So I don't mind, as an element of academic freedom, that academics be allowed to spout whatever views they want. But I think as the parent of a student, I do mind when they're put in charge of the education of my child And they are told in order to succeed in that course, they have to accept the teachings of a person who does not hold proper views. And so, as long as he doesn't pass it on to students in the classroom, I have no difficulty debating that or having him debate it, whatever his or her views are, with any person in society, or in the university for that matter. But it's when students are being told, to pass my course, you have to agree with this. And that's the problem. And that's in fact what the public schools had been doing for many generations. And that's wrong. And we shouldn't allow that to continue. Academic freedom has limitations because there should be certain threshold principles that every academic institution follows, which is that every child is entitled to be educated, to be free from racist ideology within the classroom by the teacher. Yes?
I'd just like to comment that I was at that conference, and that's a distortion. They had questions, but I felt it was done in a very respectful way with the idea of academic freedom, and what you're espousing, saying, is exactly what they said.
Thank you.
So I have no difficulty, in fact, with professors even raising as a teaching device a different point of view within the classroom. And I think we have to allow for that to happen and encourage that to happen. That's how good education occurs. But it's when you are told that this is the only way that's wrong. So.
Thank you. We have another question from the online streaming, and we have only about 5 minutes left in our talk. And so this might be the last question, unless there's someone with a burning question too here. I have a time thing to hold on. Anyway. What can
I got
ordinary citizens do to expedite the reconciliation process?
What can which?
Ordinary citizens do to expedite the reconciliation process?
Expedite.
Expedite. What did I say? Expedite.
This is a post-secondary institution.
Sorry.
Expediate is a website where you go to get hotels, right?
You know what I've been doing lately?
In fact, that's my favorite question. The reason is because it's the question that everybody needs to think about. What can I do? And you should all be thinking about that. And here's the answer. Read the damn report.
Yes, read the damn report.
Okay, so I begin with that thinking and I say, all right, it's a 6,000-page report. So don't have to read the big, heavy report, okay? There's a summary. There's a summary report. Try reading the summary report. It's only 400 pages. And if that's too much for you, we issued a summary of the summary report, which is only 140 pages long. So you can handle that. But if that's too much for you, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has issued a 60-page summary of the summary of the summary report. And that's very manageable. And it even has pictures. But what's really important is read the calls to action. There are 94 calls to action. They are aimed at various components of society, some of which you are very closely connected to, some of which you're not really connected to. Read the ones that feel close to you or that you feel close to and understand them. Look into the report and read the text behind the call to action. You can do that much. Each of the calls to action are supported with findings and evidence and basis for the call to action and what our thinking was and why we said this. Read that, understand that call to action, or those calls to action that you are connected to, and make it happen. Within your sphere of ability, and influence. Make it happen. I'll tell you, there's a group of grandmothers in the city of Winnipeg. Clara Hughes' mother is one of them. You know Clara Hughes, the Olympic athlete? Her mother is in this granny group. She calls it Granny Group. And they meet every week or so, and they read the calls to action to each other. And they talk about it. And if they don't understand what it means, they call somebody up. And they say, could you come and explain this to us? And then they say, now who's doing something about this? And they'll find out who's supposed to be doing something or who is doing something about it. And one of them will be assigned to call that person up and say, what are you doing? Would you come to our group and explain what you're doing? So they're holding people to account for each of the calls to action. And they're doing what they can do best. They can't run out there and do all the work. These are grandmothers, after all. But they do what grandmothers do, which is they point their finger at you and say, what are you doing? And I think it's a wonderful group. And that's just an example of what they're doing. There are other groups that are doing what they can too. Church congregations are doing what they can. I'm sure there are groups that you're connected to or you're aware of that you could participate with. But read the calls to action, pick one, make it happen. Another question? Is that it?
Thank you.
Is that it?
I'd like to, I've been just giving the note to say that it's time to stop.
Aw.
All right, since I've got the mic, I'll say yes to one more question and then we have to stop. I'm really
All right, you're
sorry,
it.
but
All
we're
right,
going to
you-
have
I'm
time
gonna make it really
afterwards.
fast.
This better be the best damn question of the night.
Ever.
I currently teach at SMU here, and I want to kind of speak to the lack of Indigenous professors at SMU. We have one Indigenous professor in the arts, and I believe one in the science, out of hundreds of professors. And I watch my Indigenous students really, really struggle around mentorship, Indigenous ideologies or methodologies, and so on. So I would like to ask you, what do you think our universities right here in the Atlantic, right here in Halifax, need to really focus on in terms of the lack of presence and of retention? Retention is a huge, huge issue, both for student and faculty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question, and for universities, the answer is no different for that than it is for any other component of the university that you want to address, and that is you have to make the effort. So you have to actually establish a recruiting process that looks for suitable candidates. Keep in mind that the pool of Indigenous academics out there is not as large as the need is. The need is greater than the pool available to it. But any institution that wants an academic from the Indigenous community to come and teach at it, with effort, can get that, can make it happen. Any institution. And I say that sincerely. I believe that. You have to make it worth their effort, of course, because many of the academics, quite frankly, are attending and have graduated and are working in Western universities. That's where the largest population, I think, is. Ontario probably being the next. So in order for you to get them to come here, you have to do what you would do with any candidate that you want who is working in those universities to come here, and that is you have to talk about your wonderful weather. You got to talk about the wonderful seafood that you got here. You got to talk about the beautiful terrain that's here and the beautiful countryside and the cheap and affordable housing that you have, right? You got to talk about what a wonderful living environment this is. You got to talk about the fact that you've got more universities per capita in this province than you have anywhere else in the country. And that gives you opportunities for advancement and collegiality and collaboration. And as institutions, all of those institutions should collaborate and should work together to draw those academics here. Because as I said at another university I was speaking at, somebody in this territory needs to become a center of excellence for Indigenous academia in Eastern Canada. Somebody needs to make that claim and somebody needs to become it. Because if you don't, then Western Canada will continue to claim that right and will continue to win that trophy every year. And I think you guys can do it.
Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity right now to introduce Dr. Ingrid Waldron. She's going to offer thanks, and she's been one of the main, she is the main, I can't talk today, the main mover and shaker on this lecture series. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you. So on behalf of CCEPA and the Enrich Project, as well as our sponsoring organizations, Dalhousie University's President's Office, as well as the Faculty of Health Professions, I'd like to extend our thanks to our moderator this evening, Patty Doyle-Bedwell. And also thank you, Senator Sinclair, for your engaging and thought-provoking presentation. I'd also like to thank our audience and our live stream audience for joining us tonight and for their participation in the Q&A. Our goal with this 4-part speaker series on racism over the past year was to spark critical and engaging discussions on the perennial elephant in the room, racism, and the many ways in which it manifests within our institutions and our everyday interactions in Halifax and Nova Scotia. What I believe made this series unique from other series that have been organized in the city and province is that it shed light on how racism is uniquely experienced from white, Black, Indigenous, and immigrant perspectives. Our goal was not to preach to the choir, but rather to mix it up. Have as many people in the room as possible from diverse racial and cultural backgrounds in order to engage in honest, bold, and frank discussions about how racism affects us all, not just some of us. It is our hope that we opened up a space for a more racially inclusive discussion on racism that rarely happens in this city and province. We would like to thank you all for taking this journey with us. Please be kind enough to fill out the evaluations. Tell us what you enjoyed about the program, as the feedback is very useful for planning future events. Also, please have a peek at the information on the table at the back of the room, and feel free to help yourself to any of the DVDs of past programs that are on display there, as well as information on upcoming programs. Finally, please join us for a reception in the lobby. I want to thank you all once again.